Welcome to part 2 of my atheistic moral realism. And today I'm going to talk about a science of moral realism, not just having the correct paradigm of understanding for moral claims, but also turning it into a bona fide science. And so I agree with atheist Sam Harris and others that there are right and wrong answers to moral questions, that science is our best method for rigorously figuring out that moral landscape, as he calls it. One cannot arbitrarily decide what constitutes well-being and happiness or pretend that you don't want them or wouldn't want them if you knew any better. Those are lies. There are correct and incorrect ways of acquiring and maintaining these desired mental states, and every element here is something science can and has already investigated. Just check out part 1 of the video. And we could get much, much better at doing this. All it takes is the correct practical frame of reference, and science easily fills in the blanks. And all of this amounts to descriptions of the world of facts, and combining these facts together constitutes a complete and livable moral theory that yields non-arbitrary moral prescriptions for best living practices. If you want the benefits of moral living, do X. If you are not confused or ignorant, you do or should want the benefits of moral living. If you don't want those things, you are on some variant of a path of relative self-abuse and or self-destruction, and may be exiting much more than just the conversation when your alternative values reach fruition. For engoaled beings to continue goaling, we have to be generally oriented to life and well-being and away from too many shades of destruction for bare minimum practical reasons. Dead people don't goal. Tormented people don't goal as well. People who tend to their well-being at all levels goal the best. So 4 winning traits towards happiness. In the meantime, atheist historian and philosopher Richard Carrier relays studies to us that show us that there are 4 virtues that best help us maintain the happiness and avoid the harm: being honest, reasonable, brave, and compassionate. If you aren't honest, then you can't properly navigate from the bad places to the good places because you don't know where you are actually at. If you aren't reasonable, then you aren't likely to arrive at your happiness destination because of your own ineptitude or excess. If you are a coward and too reticent for emotional change, then the negative status quo is your destiny. And if you aren't compassionate, the world of other people is going to be a miserable one that you will continually navigate poorly and bring down hell on yourself as a result. Self-control. Atheist philosopher Steven Pinker adds that people who happen to have greater measures of self-control are most likely to attain and maintain their measure of happiness. Honesty, reasonableness, bravery, and compassion won't go so far if not enacted consistently. And the smarter folk tend to put themselves in circumstances where they don't have to wage constant battles with self-control in the first place. And they save that mental energy for the battles they do have to wage. Inescapable despite our foibles. You aren't going to escape these things in your moral theory, and if you do, you've escaped your humanity. The problems between people, groups, cultures, and time periods result from the details. We're weak epistemology machines full of cognitive biases, ignorance, false beliefs, and cultures having their own brand of these issues, getting us off on the wrong foot, and perhaps not even providing correct options at all. I feel incredibly lucky to be born in the time period and culture that I've been born into that has at least given me a vast array of options, virtually everything on the market of human wisdom since the beginning of recorded history to choose from. I wish I'd been born into a specific and successful Star Trek-like culture where all of the important disputes have been culturally resolved and the solutions have long since been put into practice to amazing success, but surely a cultural buffet that at least includes the good options is a reasonable runner-up to that, with democracy and science being the appropriate tools to perhaps eventually get us there, or at least get our children or grandchildren there. Finding common moral denominators to solve. The trick in translating between value systems is in finding the common moral denominators and then solving the equation with greater consistency than the next moralizer. If you've ever changed your mind about a moral question, then you admit you can be wrong on your own terms and that there must be a means of your own correction. The correct way to approach the conversation is by learning to set everything about your moral theory on the table for mutual review. being willing to be wrong and correctable, and taking the next person's moral view just as seriously as your own. You take it all together, correct the easy facts, such as finding out if witches even exist for them to be sufferable to live or not, find the common denominators, i.e. Preventing malicious behavior in the instance of, offing witches, and using consistent standards of reasoning to sort out the pros and cons of the differences in order to correct the harder facts. And the harder facts are the actual application of values. If there really is no way to decide between your X and their Y, then both X and Y are just as good or just as bad, even if you don't happen to have an equal affinity or repulsion for Y. And if there is an issue with their Y and not your X, then where is it? Show it. Agreeing to disagree and moral relativism are failures of moral imagination and are intellectual cop-outs. Liberals on authority, loyalty, purity, and freedom. Even liberals may tend to revolve around their favorite scientists and scholars. They may police their social justice groups and ostracize threatening people, and may tend to be particularly concerned with just how healthy and natural their food is or isn't, whether or not the facts agree. That's authority, group loyalty, and purity. We also champion free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and our rights to our own virtues and vices insofar as they leave others free to pursue their own virtues and vices. That's freedom. The folly of pure liberty. An overfocus on liberty is socially anemic and misses out on the powerful things we can and should do together, things that can't be done as well or even at all as individuals, and aimed at goals that humanity would be foolish to fail to acquire and maintain for everyone. Libertarians, as high systemizers and low empathizers, are often actually benefiting from collectivistic morality, and yet ideologically attempting to gnaw off their own arms to get out of what they perceive as a trap. Obviously, a hyper-collectivistic society that pre-obligated every human behavior would be oppressive, even if the supposed benefits would be socially maximized, hypothetically. But if no individual wants to live there, then what is the point? Achieving a reasonable balance between the virtues of liberty and social obligation seems key. A pure libertarian society is that of the post-apocalyptic road warrior movies where everyone fends for themselves, and the other extreme is where an all-domineering government can't possibly keep on top of everything to manage it well. Every society since there has been civilization has been somewhere in between those extremes. And those who cannot bring themselves to see the benefits of any collective effort for the sake of the good don't seem to have a place at the adult table, because they don't believe in tables. Principle desiring. Morality, when properly understood, is at its root merely principle desiring. All desires are inherently value neutral outside of the relationship to other desires. Hence, good desires are desires that tend to fulfill other desires, and bad desires are desires that tend to thwart other desires. It is the only way for desires and corporate desiring beings such as ourselves to be fair to one another. Desires, by their nature, want to be fulfilled and do not want to be thwarted. All rational desiring beings will therefore recognize the principle here. Even evil people hate it when you stop them from getting what they want, and so the remaining portion is for the evil people to not be thwarting other people's desires in the first place. And even evil people recognize good people as people who respect the desires of others. Everyone thinks fulfilling their own desires is good in a primitive sense. Everyone thinks that those who treat others' desires as equal are exercising the principled good. And when people treat the desires of others as even greater than their own, we respect that as the superlative good. But we also recognize the excesses of martyrdom, where for some reason other people are important, but inexplicably you aren't. And you self-sabotage to the point of not being able to over-prioritize the interests of others after all. Hence, the martyr proves it was really just about the self-satisfying of their own morality desires, but not actually about tending to the persistent needs of the people they supposedly cared about. It can be ironically selfish to not tend to self in context of the needs of others who require you to be stable and basically satisfied with your own existence. We tolerate a measure of desire thwarting in service of greater desire fulfillment. Getting a shot hurts, but being inoculated against a deadly disease is worth the temporary pain. But not too much, lest we make ourselves sadists who are incapable of living in the better world we supposedly are trying to create. Or we become people who are incapable of sustaining the personal misery that may be required to get there because of the irreparable damage to the functioning of our social emotions. So the ends may only justify the means within a reasonable measure. Cops might have to speed to catch a vehicular speeder in service of protecting the roads generally from speeders, but they also may resort to other methods to catch a speeder because they know they can contribute to the problem and make things even more dangerous for the public, which is obviously something they're specifically trying to avoid. And so most reasonable people will respect governments who use only the minimum of violence necessary to prevent further violence. And if we can figure out how to have a world entirely free of violence, then even that provisional principle gets subsumed. And we don't respect a police force that flaunts its force and uses it above and beyond what is necessary to serve the public good. Cops who pull you over fishing for any reason to write you a ticket in order to fulfill a quota or just to be mean to a person like you are not respected as doing their jobs. And if they consistently embitter the public they supposedly serve and protect, their existence is no longer an asset, but just an arbitrary side in a war. On the same page with Jesus, incidentally, for my Christian viewers. Jesus himself promises true inner peace in this life and continually dangles the carrot of the rewards of the kingdom of heaven and avoidance of the eternal torture of hell as the basis of listening to his moral advice. That is a consequential happiness versus harm metric as well as a balance of inner virtue. And Jesus' golden rule of love your neighbor as yourself is a straightforward expression of principled desire that respects one's neighbor's desires as equivalent to one's own rather than arbitrarily privileging yours at their expense. Of course, virtually every ancient rabbi probably consoled themselves that in actuality, all of their moralizing boiled down to just love. And how could there be anything wrong with that? Well, if it doesn't actually all boil down to love, but you just say it is, then there's obviously that is wrong with that. I read in a book, Judging Jesus, a Secular Human Perspective, which is what I'm taking this from, will discuss how Jesus failed miserably in his application of his own golden rule in a variety of ways. But the core principle of a respect for the desires of others and the underlying allure of the benefits of a consistent moral life is basically the same. Compatibility with divine command theory. My view of moral realism is theoretically compatible with the possibility of a divine moral authority in that a supreme perfect desiring being could logically exist, know most everything there is to know about perfectly principled desiring, and dole out sound and valid advice to lesser desiring beings such as ourselves. And in fact, I would personally prefer this to be the case. Like most human beings, I value a good authority and would emotionally benefit from there being one I could trust. I just don't think that is actually the case in divine terms for reasons that will only occasionally be touched on here in the book that I've written, and aside from the obvious general case against Jesus as a worthy moral teacher. See my Judging Jesus series. Homefield advantage. In this section on my moral theory, I did not point to anything that the reader cannot verify for themselves to be true. I did not ask you to take my word for anything. I showed what makes us ask moral questions and why we care about moral questions. And I showed why it is worth being a moral person and what the limits of that domain practically are for any non-delusional worldview. And I showed that any divine command theory is going to have to embrace the very same components that are already working well in their own right on their own terms, and the divine command theory merely adds speculative and unnecessary pieces to the puzzle. Pieces that in practice you'll find amount to bringing egregious moral violations into our moral ideology as they represent the morality mistakes of our ancestors and not any divine will at all. As it is, this represents a home field advantage for agnostic humanism in the competition between worldviews. I've appealed to what we already have, evidence available to pretty much everyone. If there is more, then prove it. Show up to bat, bases loaded, and hit it out of the park. Or go home to Never Never Land, Oz, Narnia, or Hogwarts, or wherever you think home is. We know what good is, and we know how to judge it, even if we struggle to define it. Many people can speak just fine without being able to write a perfect dictionary, and many people can live a moral life without being able to define it for moral philosophers. Morality is already a philosophical crime in progress, and an astute investigation of each crime scene ought to tell us just about everything about the culprits involved, especially given they are still there every day in our lives. Morality philosophers ought to be able to help us out with that. but so often they don't. And I think I'll touch on that issue in the next video.